This is Kirk, the bariatric carnivore. I've got some bad news for you guys who want to trust the science. Half of it is probably false. And that's not me. I mean, I'm not smart enough to make that type of pronouncement. That was actually from Dr. John Ioannidis, who's a professor at Stanford who does statistical research, plus he's a medical school professor. And when he started analyzing studies, he found that 90% of them, probably 50% of them, could not be reproduced, which means, frankly, they're not science. If you can't do the same experiment again and get the same result, you got a problem. That ain't science. That is just a paper, but if it's not reproducible, it isn't science. And it gets, frankly, even worse. That was back in 2005. More recently, he's been analyzing even more studies, and he found out that about 90% of them are flat out false. It's not just him. I mean, he's not a crank. He happens to be the author of the most cited paper in all of science. So he's well respected in that realm. And if he's saying that 90% of the stuff that's being put out is just flat out junk, and that's the science that we're supposed to follow, we got a problem. The former editor of The Lancet, maybe one of the top medical journals on the planet, said that 50% of the stuff that they are putting out in a medical journal that doctors are supposed to look at in order to help treat patients is false. Flat out false. Basically because companies, major pharmaceuticals, are buying the research and nobody's double checking them. See, nobody has the money to check out things that aren't profitable. And that becomes a problem. You know, how many of you guys heard over the last couple of years that vitamin D was really important to support immune health? Well, frankly, unless you paid attention to alternative news sources, you didn't hear anything about it because there's no money behind it. And there's great science, that's been going on for over nearly 80 years that shows how important vitamin D is to immune health. Science, the doctors know it, but they're not really allowed to talk about it much. You know why? Because the quote-unquote science journals, when they are put together into what they call a meta-analysis, is when you look at several studies. The problem is if you're looking at several bad studies, many of which are false, you're coming to come to some bad conclusions. And these bad conclusions become the medical guidelines that your doctor is forced, because very few people go to a doctor that is independent. They work for major companies, and these major companies make deals with insurance companies, and they create guidelines, and your doctor that you think is working for you is actually forced to represent the guidelines. And if that doesn't do it, then they have to worry about their own medical board, which also produces guidelines, often resulting from bad science. And you start to see the scope of the problem, that your health is suddenly being determined by doctors who are getting bad information, half of which in the major journals is probably false, and they're being told to do it because that's what the guidelines, and their job depends on it. And the scope of the problem just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Nobody, strangely enough, meat manufacturers, the people that, the ranchers that produce really good quality beef, they can't afford to do studies showing that eating a carnivore diet is healthy, but big food can. That's why big sugary soda manufacturers and processed food manufacturers can produce tons of studies that say, oh, it all boils down to calories in, calories out. And they can produce studies that will say, oh, if you eat a low-fat diet full of this processed glop, you're going to live to be healthy. Even though all the evidence that you see around you tells you that's just not true. Look, that's 70% of the calories that most people eat every single day are from processed food. And do you think people are getting healthier? Take a look around at Walmart sometime and tell me how many people look healthier than they did 30 years ago. Ever since we switched our dietary guidelines to this low-fat, high-carb diet, people have been getting more and more unhealthy every single year. Now, how does that really affect your health, though, at the end of the day? Because, look, at the end of the day, our government is telling us to trust the science. Well, I don't know how many people saw in today's paper what the scientists did when it came to the COVID jab. And this isn't an editorial on, what you think about the COVID response. I'm talking about the fact that there are now emails out that showed that the public health officials knew the jab was not going to be effective, was not going to stop COVID, and they pushed it anyway. They told our soldiers they had to get the jab or they'd be discharged, maybe with a less than honorable. They told us we couldn't travel without it. The media was screaming at us, telling us that we were going to kill grandma and that we ought to create a two-tiered health system that for people who got the shot and those that didn't. Even though the public health officials knew with certainty, based on their own email traffic between Fauci and all the other heads in Washington, D.C., that the thing didn't work. We have a psychopathic healthcare system that is flat out lying to us. So what do? I mean, how do you figure out what the heck's true? Because look, for every study, there's 1 million studies, literally 1 million scientific studies put out every single year. How do you sort it out? Well, one of my favorite sayings is, look, if you don't know what to do, look at what the majority are doing and don't do that. If the majority of people are, if 70% of their calories are coming from processed food and they're getting a half a pound of sugar every single day because they're eating processed food and they're eating all these ultra-processed grains and all these foods with 20 ingredients on the label, and they're getting ridiculously unhealthy. If you don't do that, don't you think your health is going to improve? Just try an experiment for 90 days. If you're not part of this group already, for the next 90 days, vow to yourself, I'm not going to eat anything that's got an ingredient label on it. So basically that means I'm going to be eating meat and eggs and vegetables. Maybe some butter or something like that. And just do that for 90 days and see what happens to your health. And I'm going to bet you're going to wake up in a week or two and you're going to notice a lot of those aches and pains have gone away. And you're going to start sleeping better and you're going to start feeling like moving again. Do your own self-experiment and your own research. That is the best chance you've got to maintain as much health as you possibly can. And if you think, well, that sounds a little extreme, look, you've been doing what they've been telling you to do for the last 30 years, and you've been watching everybody's health decline. Do you think you can give yourself 90 days to try and experiment on yourself to see if this actually works? And if it doesn't, well, you can move on. But you're not going to kill yourself in 90 days. But if you continue eating the way you're doing, you are stuck in the medical system. And frankly, it is going to get dangerous. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is pushing what's called the pandemic treaty. And the pandemic treaty, that gives them complete control over what is the science. They're going to be able to determine what is the science, because they'll be able to shut down social media companies from being able to give out alternative views. So if you don't agree with the WHO, your voice will not be heard. And if you notice that if 90% of the studies are false, then frankly, we got a problem. We are being held at by the short hairs by the large corporate interest. And if you think, well, we can trust the WHO, let me tell you who's on the board of directors of the WHO. North Korea. North Korea is going to have more say as to what you get to do for your health than the United States of America. That's the reality of that particular treaty. So Your only best bet in this whole thing is to figure out how to get yourself healthy and get out of the system. Because it's, frankly, a psychopathic system. It's not working in the best interest of your health. I'm sorry, that's just a reality. When you look at the numbers and you look at the reality, that's what it is. So your only alternative, get healthy. And if you like this message, please hit the like and subscribe button. Share this with other people. The more people that hear this message, the more people can actually see this video, and YouTube will share it with others. This is Kirk, the Bariatric Carnivore. I try to put out a new message every single workday, and I will talk to you soon.